All right, Rabbi, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. So today's daf is Chaf Vav. We are picking up on Chaf Hey Amud Beis. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Ed and Faith Wolf, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushas this month in memory of beloved father, grandfather, and great-grandfather Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our Week of Learning sponsor, Joe and Galia Barry, in honor of their 43rd wedding anniversary and successful Aliyah 3.5 years ago. Yeshikoach and Mazel Tov. And also thank you to anonymous sponsor for the Day of Learning today in the Schos of Refuah Shalema for Chaim Eden Shalom ben Alta Braina. We hope that the Chola has a complete refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And Abossi, with that, let us begin. Okay, so we are picking up, today's daf is Chavav 26. And again, we are picking up bottom of Chav Ham and Beis 25b, 4 lines up from the bottom. So an interesting case, continuing a little bit on the well, we'll see. Hahu aburnika, the Havle Reish Galusa bebustanya. So we'll say there was an aburnika. Now Rashi says over here, if you look at Rashi, aburniki, Elon shetzilo meruba. It is a tree that has a lot of shade. V'notin oso hasarin, and the nobility plants it. V'osin itztabaos tachtav svivosav lehislonin tachtav b'mosachamo l'sameach sham. So it's actually quite beautiful. So an aburnik also was a very large tree that had a lot of branches. And what they would do is the nobility would plant a tree like this, like in the middle of the property, and they would set up a whole bunch of benches underneath the tree, so that this way again people would relax underneath the shade of the tree during the summer. Beautiful, beautiful. So if you can imagine it, so again, it's any tree. Like I think about it's like a willow tree, like the weeping willow trees, where the branches extend downwards. If it's large, you could have an area underneath. Again, I don't know that it matters what type of tree it is. But Lamai says the tree that gave men a lot of shade and nobility would create a seating area underneath it. Good. So what happens? So in the Reish Galusa's house, they had this bibustana. We'll say bustana is an orchard, right? An orchard. So Rashi says over here, this orchard, I will say, was more than 2 base sa'ah, and it was not enclosed for the purposes of, for residential purposes. So we'll say, so just so we get our facts over here. So I have this beautiful tree, right? This tree seating area in a karfeif that is more than 2 base sa'ah, that has not been enclosed for residential purposes. So we'll say, so again, just off the bat, what's the halacha with the karfeif that's more than 2 base sa'ah, not enclosed for residential purposes? Can't carry in it. Okay, fine. Here's the issue. Amalei the Rafuna bar Chinana. So we'll say, so Reish Galusa says Rafuna bar Chinana, listen, le'aved mar takanta, so the Reish Galusa says to Rav Huna, here's the deal. I want to have lunch underneath the tree tomorrow, so I need you to figure out how to make that happen. All right, how is it that I could go ahead and eat underneath that tree tomorrow? So Rashi says over here, actually not yet. So what happens? What did he do? Azul avad kana pachos mishlosha. So we'll say, so what did Rav Huna do? Rav Huna went ahead and, so we'll say, so we're going to see exactly, I'm going to actually take you to a Rashi on the other daf in just a moment, but essentially what he did is as follows. He enclosed the tree with posts that were put into the ground that were less than 3 tfachim away from one another. So we'll say, what did he essentially do? He made a loved mechitza around the tree. By making a loved mechitza around the tree, this way again the tree was enclosed, you can carry food, you can carry whatever you want there. So we'll say, so we're going to see in fact what he really did. We're going to see it's actually interesting. There's a Rashi on Amud Aleph which has a little bit of a different understanding of the story, which we'll see. But Lamaisa, we're going to see what he really did is he created essentially a mechitza that this, if you can imagine, this mechitza really led from the house to the tree. Because we'll say that would enable them to take food from the house to the tree. But the point over here is he made a mechitza around the tree, made up of boards, put into the ground, less than 3 tefachim away from each other. Good. So we'll say, watch what happened. Also Rava. So Rava came along. He was following behind Rav Huna, top of Chavav. Shalfinhu. So we'll say, so Rava came along, and every single time Rav Papa put a post in the ground, Rava took it out. Talk about someone undermining your efforts, right? So Rava went ahead and took it out. Then Abba said, what happened? Then Azor Rav Papa Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua Naktilu Mibasrei. Then Abba said, Rav Papa and Rav Huna Breid Rav Yoshua followed behind Rava, and when Rava took the post out, Rav Papa and Rav Huna took the post away. They wanted to make sure that Rav Huna wouldn't put it back in the ground. Okay, so the Gemara says, Eisvei Ravina l'Rava. So the next day, L'machar Eisvei Ravina l'Rava. So the next day, Ravina raised the kasha to Rava. And what did he say? So Ir Chadasha, we'll say if you have a brand new city, and we'll define that term in just a moment. Modidin Lami Yeshivasa. So we're talking about now Tchum Shabbos. So as we said before, Tchum Shabbos Talocha is that you have 2,000 amas from the edge of the city. That measures your distance of mobility on Shabbos. So if you have a new city, you go ahead and you measure the 2,000 amas miyeshivasa from actual habitation, from where the last house is. V'yeshana, if you have an old city, mechomasa, you measure the 2,000 amas from the walls of the city. Ezohi chadasha ve'ezohi yeshana. But say, let's define our terms. What is a new city and what is an old city? To which the Gemara says, chadasha shehokfa ulubasov yashva. So we'll say a new city is a city which was first walled and then settled. So we'll say, remember again, we've seen this before. So a wall, an enclosure, is only considered to be for residential purposes if what? If the residences preceded the wall. If the wall was there first, that's not called hukfa ladira. So what the Gemara calls an ir chadasha, new city, is a city which was walled first and inhabited later. So such a city like that wall is not significant halachically, and therefore in measuring the tchum, you're going to measure from the last house, not the last wall. Yeshana, what's an old city? Yashva ulabasof hukva. That is a city which was first inhabited and then walled. And therefore we'll say because that is a proper wall, that's called the domicile wall or hukva ladira wall. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, you will go ahead and measure the tchum from that wall. So we'll say, why is this important? V'hainami ki hukva ulabasof yashva. So the Gemara wants to suggest this bustani, right? This orchard is like an enclosure, like an ir chadasha, which was first enclosed and then settled. So we'll say what they were telling Rava was you were wrong for removing the posts. We'll say what's tolchap? Rava felt that the posts weren't needed. Why? Because the Maisa, he felt that the presence of that aburnika, the presence of that tree, made the karfeif into a makom dira, made the karfeif into a domicile, and therefore the wall means that this was an area that was hukaf ladira. And even though it's more than 2 beis sa'ah, that's fine. More than 2 beis sa'ah, you could carry there as long as the area is enclosed for residential purposes. So Rava thought the presence of the tree, and it's not just the tree. Remember, this was like an entertaining space, right? This was an outdoor space. So Rava felt the presence of the tree with the benches converts the entire karfeif into a domicile. And therefore the wall is an enclosure for a domicile and works even for more than 2 beis sa'ah. That's why he felt that what Rav Huna was doing by putting in those posts was totally unnecessary. So what Ravina was telling Rava was, you're wrong. And I'll tell you why. Because even if you want to claim that the aburnika, that the tree, makes it into a domicile, the problem is the wall was there first. And whenever the wall was there before the domicile, the wall is not called a domicile enclosure. Also, remember we had this 3 days ago, where the Gemara said, what do you do if you have a wall there first before habitation? What do you do? What do you do? Breach the wall, right? So you could redo it, meaning you could breach the wall 10 amas. Remember we had the case, what if you breach an amma, rebuild an amma, breach an amma, rebuild an amma. So it's fine. You could go ahead and kind of repurpose that wall, but it requires you to breach it and then rebuild it. But to just kind of use it as, so therefore again, I'll say, so this is really fascinating. So Rava felt that the presence of the aburnika essentially went ahead and converted the karfeif into a domicile. And therefore it was a domicile more than 2 beis sa'ah, but enclosed. No problem, you don't need the posts. Rav Huna understood that no. The wall came first, the aburnika came second. Therefore, this was like an ir chadasha. This was like a new city. Whenever you have the wall before the domicile, the wall does not work as an enclosure. Therefore, the posts were necessary. So the Gemara says, Amar li Rav Papa le Rava. So Rabbi said to Ravasi, so this is actually very interesting. But Ravasi said as follows: Mechitzos adar kalin lo shma mechitza. So we'll say what a mechitzos adar kalin. Look at Rashi. Benoim sheosin mechitza letzel tzvivo sehem kishebonim bechamas. Let's listen to this. So apparently, when workers would go ahead and construction workers would go ahead and work on a site, so they would go ahead and put up like a partition. They'd put up a mechitza. They will say, but the point of that mechitza, Rashi says over here, was for shade. So now what the Gemara is saying is as follows. Ravasi said, so Rav Papa said to Rava, that Ravasi said that mechitzas are the kolin. Mechitzas that are made for shade, lo shma mechitza, are not called a mechitza. Alma kevan de litzniusa avidala, lo havya mechitza. Therefore, again, I will say, any mechitza that's just done, ultimately, again, for shade, or what he calls, or what they call privacy purposes, is not called the mechitza. Hachanami kevan de litzniusa avida lo havya mechitza. So too over here, the Gemara wants to suggest that in the posts of Rav Huna, it also would not be a good mechitza. Look at Rashi, kevan de litzniusahi ulamachar sasri la lav klumhi v'hanami litzniusa diyom valayla ba'almahi da'avida v'lav diruhu. Furthermore, again, I will say, ultimately, again, the post that the Gemara is now suggesting, even if you're right that at the end of the day, even if you're right that Rava was wrong, and let's say again the orchard was not considered to be enclosed because Lamaisa, again, the wall was there before the domicile, Rav Huna's mechitza is not good. Why? Because I will say in general we assume that any mechitza that's just there for privacy purposes, right? Or ultimately, again, for what we'll call comfort purposes, to shade from the sun, that's not called a mechitza. And I will say, Bepashtos, Rav Huna's wall, so to speak, his mechitza came into that category. Why? He was going to put it up Erev Shabbos and take it down when? Motzei Shabbos. So we'll say, so it wasn't really done to affect an enclosure. Rashi understands over here that it was done ultimately, again, for some type of comfort purpose, nias purpose, and therefore not effective. But Rav Huna said to Rava, Rav Huna, mechitza suya lenachis, lo shma mechitza. We know that a mechitza, Rashi says, lenachis, or lenachas, Rashi says, shalolad rosham elo lehishtamer mashi anichu sham. We'll say that if you create a mechitza for storage purposes, what if you create a partition, but the primary purpose of the partition is to serve as storage? So what's the halacha? It's not called the mechitza. But this is actually very interesting. Daha Rabba Baravua ma'ariv la lekula mechuza arsaisa. So listen to this. In the city of Mechuza, so Rabba Baravua made each individual neighborhood make its own eruv. Then I will say, now the city of Mechuza technically was enclosed. Yet interestingly enough, Rabbi Baravua made each individual neighborhood make its own mechitza. Rashi says over Arsaisa, shchunos levad, ubecho shchuna hayim avuos harbe, v'lo hitir esa'ir kula biyachad, va'afa pi shahaisi ir kitana, shenichnasin ba shishim revo, utnan lekamon ir shal yachid ma'avines kula. So we'll say, interestingly enough, even though Mechuza was technically a small city, and on a technical level, they could have made one eruv for the entire city. They didn't do so. Interestingly enough, why not? We'll say this is really fascinating. Mishum pera de beituri, because of the oxen pits. I will say, now what does this mean? Look at Rashi. This is really very interesting. Mishum pera de beituri. See Rashi. You also have a picture there in Rashi. Mishum pera de beituri. Shocha amuka haisa ben shchuna shchuna. We'll say, so again, you can see in the picture in Rashi that you see a number of different chatzeros, right? So those, I'm assuming we'll have the same picture in Rashi. So those squares, I will say, are different chatzeros. In between each chatzer ultimately is a mavui, and in between, I guess we'll call it perpendicular to the chatzeros are those two reshuyos harabim. In those reshuyos harabim also were these pits, these trenches. I will say now, what would happen in those trenches? Look at Rashi. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, what people would do is they would throw their date pits into those trenches, and oxen would feed there. So these were kind of like, almost it looks like communal troughs for the oxen. So there were these trenches in the middle of Rosh Hashanah. He says, "Va'ir ein lachoma, umavol shel bein bati hashchunos mefulashin, va'asu mechitzos l'rashem avos." So we'll say, listen to this. So they had these communal troughs in the middle of Rosh Hashanah. The city was not enclosed, but there are mechitzos. There are mechitzos at the side of every mavui, as well as at the sides of the Rosh Harabim. So the Gemara says, so what happened? So the Gemara says over here, so we'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, but 1 second. So, I'm sorry, let's finish the Rashi. Rashi says, so the chod sad shechutz la'ir, lehishtamir hagarinen, v'lo chashiv lemechitza. Now, both say, now listen to this. Now they would go ahead and if you could look in the picture of Rashi, so remember again, those wide open spaces, that's the Rosh Hashanah. So inside the Rosh Hashanah is what we'll call the pit trench, right? The feeding trough for the animals. They made mechitzas, if you look, at the end of each Rosh Hashanah. If you look at that. But both say, now interestingly enough, now mechitzas at the end of each Rosh Hashanah, shouldn't that be enough to go ahead and enclose the city in its entirety? Yet it was not. Why not? Why not, Rabosai? Because those mechitzas, why were they really made? They were made to protect the trenches. They were made to protect the content of the trenches. So I'll say, what do you see from here? That a mechitza that is made for storage purposes is not really a mechitza. It's not really a mechitza. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so again, now interestingly enough, what does this have to do with our sugya? So look at Rashi, Peira, Shocha kimo Peira, fine. V'hach mechitza d'Rav Huna, chasuy l'nachiz damya, shina nasis l'dira tamid lotzeis v'lavaba. So we'll say, the Gemara says that the partition that Rav Huna made, halacha l'maisa, was really like a mechitza that was made for storage purposes. Why? Because I will say, the idea being is, what the Gemara seems to be saying over here, although this is a little bit against what we've established until now, is any mechitza that is clearly just temporary in nature and is going to go ahead and really just be put in and be taken out, the Gemara wants to suggest is not called a real mechitza. That's called like a mechitza for storage or a mechitza for shade, and therefore will not be good. Now we'll say, halacha l'maisa, we'll see that that is not necessarily the case. But that's what they seem to be saying over here. So we'll say, so what happened? So the Gemara says, Kari ale Reish Galusa. So the Reish Galusa was upset. Now we'll say, the reason why the Reish Galusa was upset, because at the end of the day, when is this discussion happening? This discussion is happening on Shabbos or on Sunday when it's already too late to do anything about it. And the Reish Galusa got annoyed because apparently at the end of the day, he did not have the ability to have lunch under his abornika, which is what he wanted. So he said, Chachamim heima lahara lehetiv lo yadu. So we'll say, he said, these rabbis, quoting over here, it's quoting the pasuk from Yirmiyahu, Chachamim heima lahara, they're wise to do damage, but to do good, they don't do. Right? Nice that you rabbis are having this out now. Why couldn't someone find me a solution when I needed it? Okay, good. Apparently, attitude towards Rabbanim doesn't change that much over time. Right? That's so good. So let's say, so the Gemara says, sorry, the Reish Galusa was incredibly annoyed that why didn't they find the solution before? So we'll say, so look at this Rashi now. It's a very important Rashi because now it's a little bit. This Rashi also is going to reframe the whole sugya a little bit, and then we're going to say, look at Rashi, Lahara, Lesar, Obitshuvas Hagaomim, Matzasi Belashon Acher, V'yasher Be'enai Me'od. So Rashi says, I found a different understanding of this Gemara in the Chuvas Hagaomim, and I like it much better than the one I presented before. And watch this. Hahu Bustana Karfef Yosher Beis Hasaim Shalok over there. So Rashi is now just going to give a quick run through of the story. What was the story? There was an orchard. Right, there was an orchard, and inside of that orchard, there was a right. So Bustana was a karfef that was more than 2 beis that was not enclosed for residential purposes. So we'll say, and then what happened? So you have the karfef that is more than 2 beis. Then you have the abornika, which is a tree under which you have seating that nobility used to build. So what happened? So what did Reish Lakish need to do? The Reish Lakish needed to carry stuff from the entranceway of the karfef, which was right near his home, to the abornika. Va'avid Rav Huna bar China kamin shivil min Pesach ad abornika. So now the imagery is a little bit different. So now what Rav Huna did is he built a pathway, a mechitza pathway from, let's say, the entranceway of the Reish Galusa's home all the way to the abornika. Geder mikan, the geder mikan, the kana pachos migimel. And I will say he built a loved mechitza. He built a loved wall, right? So mechitza that extended all the way from the entranceway of the home all the way to the abornika with the mechitzas there. So what happened? The Rava Kishafinu lo le'esor ela lahakel. The Rabbi say this is very important. We know this because we've seen this before. When Rava pulled out the posts, see, Rabbi say, it's not that Rava was making. You read this story, you think, oh, Rava's making a macho. We will have no mechitza here. No, Rava was not trying to be machmir. Rava was trying to be mekel. He thought that what Rav Huna was doing was totally unnecessary. You don't need another mechitza here. The sirle the sherle tatule bekula bustana. The chevan de banala aburnika bustana shavya lekula bustana chatzer ula aburnika vavi mukaf ladira. So we'll say, so Rava felt Rav Huna, you're imposing an unnecessary chumrah. Once the aburnika is here, that transforms the entire karfif into a domicile. Once it's a domicile, it's also enclosed by a wall. It is an area that is hukaf ladira, and you could carry throughout the entire area. You don't need Rav Huna. I don't need your loved wall. Va'asu talmidei dirava rapav Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua naktinu t'lalehadi Rav Huna bar China v'letakninu. So then what happened? Then came along Rav Papa and Rav Huna, who were the Talmidim of Rava, and after Rava pulled out the board, what happened? The Talmidim went ahead and took away the boards. The Rabbi said, very important mussar in this. So why didn't Rav Papa and Rav Huna just take out the boards themselves? Oh, because I will say that you don't do. That would have been disrespectful to Rav Huna. See, Rava could argue on Rav Huna, but the Talmidim of Rava cannot argue on Rav Huna. So therefore, again, once the Rebbe went ahead and took out the boards, they could then take the boards away, but they could not take the boards out themselves. So I will say, what happened? So let's just finish the Rashi. Vahi shaitelo adkar luhu delav shapir avid delashafinu. We will say now, again, obviously Rava thought he was doing the right thing, but he did not, at that point, he did not realize that he was mistaken. Ulamachar adkir va'osvu kid amar lamachar esir avinu l'Rava ir chadasha v'hai bustana nami kehokof ulubasof yashav dami shekodim nitiasa makifan osu ula'achar shegadla ivan asu ha'bornika savav hilchach shapir avad Rav Huna bar Chinina v'rapapa osva memechitzas ardikalin. So I'm sorry. So I'll say, so therefore what happened? The next day they went through the sugya, and Rava realized he was wrong. He was wrong because at the end of the day, because the wall of the karfef was there first, and it was only converted into a domicile by the aburnika later on, that is not called an area that is enclosed for residential purposes. And therefore, in fact, either what you had to do was either what? Breach the wall, breach the primary wall, 10 amas, and rebuild it, that would work, or alternatively, Rav Huna's eitzah of building the loved wall. So the Gemara says, Shapir Av Rav Huna bar Chinna. V'Rav Papa osei mechitzas ardikala da mechitza da abornika nami litznias avida v'chein lenaches l'shtamish lahaniach ba talisosehen ulevoshehen sheposhten sham ushar kli tashmishem karyaleh Rav Papa Rav Huna Rav Yoshua shal niskar esma v'sasru tikuno shal Rav Huna bar Chinna v'achshav nasu chachamim lasra alav ulehetiv lo yadu esma v'chinika. So we'll say, so then again, they go through the entire sugya. They realized that Rav Huna was correct, Rava was wrong. They tried to bring another contradiction to Rav Huna, that perhaps, again, the type of mechitza that he built would not have been effective anyway. Turns out they are wrong about that as well. The Reish Galusa gets upset, really upset at Rava, because at Rava, you went ahead and you pulled out the posts, thereby preventing me from going ahead and utilizing this area on Shabbos. Had all of you had this discussion before you took action, I could have had a nice lunch under my aburnika. But because of that, I'm angry, I'm upset at you Rabbanim, because you did not darshan this out. I should also say there's an incredible mussar in this in general, which is, clearly, again, Rava made a mistake. Again, obviously, he made a mistake because he thought his svara was right and Rav Huna was wrong. But Lemais, an incredible mussar in that sometimes we take action without fully understanding the circumstances. When we do that, we generally make mistakes. And by the time that we realize the mistakes that we've made, damage has been done. Granted, in this case, the damage was that the Reish Galusa missed out on a lunch in his abornika. He's going to live. He's going to be just fine. But in life, sometimes we take action without realizing all of the information, and the damage is much worse. an incredible, incredible musar, that before we take decisive action in life, make sure you understand the circumstances which you are in, and make sure the ramifications of the actions you are taking. Beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, "Vafilu beiskar." So Amar Beloi Shmatir me Rabbi Eliezer Vafilu beiskar. So we'll say we're going back now to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah discussed the karfeif. The Mishnah discussed the karfeif, and remember again in the case of the karfeif. So what happens? So we had a discussion about the maximum size of a karfeif. So the first opinion said 2 beis sa'ah. That's the maximum size of a karfeif. So comes along Rabbi Eloi. He said, I heard the name Rabbi Eliezer. Afilu, even a base core. Rabbi said, just to understand, what's a base core? A base core is 30 beis sa'ah. 30 beis sa'ah. So we just went from 2 beis sa'ah to 30 beis sa'ah. So maslisin dol kechananya. So our Mishnah clearly does not reflect the view of Chananya either. The Sanya Chananya omer vafilu hi arboim sa'ah ki istracha shel melech. Even if the karfeif is 40 sa'ah, like again the courtyard of the king, or actually Rashi says kasar shel melech means rachba shachori platin v'sham hayu mitaylim tamid alma deika darbachi. So others say it's the backyard of the palace, or the gardens of the palace. So I'll say it's interesting enough. Chananya says your karfeif could be even up to 40 beis sa'ah. Sorry. So the Gemara says Amar Rabbi Yochanan u'shnei mikra echad darshu. So we'll say, by the way, where do we get these shiurim of 30 beis sa'ah, 40 beis sa'ah, which are incredibly large areas? So the Gemara says they both. Rabbi Yochanan says they both start from the same pasuk. We'll say this is incredible. Shneimar vayhi Yeshayahu. Vayhi Yeshayahu lo yotza. Now this is actually very interesting. Lo yotza chatzer hatichona u'devar Hashem hayo elav lemor. He did not even go out to the outer courtyard, and the word of God came to him. Now both saying this is fascinating. Ksiv, the pasuk itself, that's if you have the Torah or if you have the psukim on the side of your Gemara, you'll actually see that the word that is written in the Navi is ir, is city. It's a Korean ksiv. The word that's written is ir, yet the word that is read is chatzer. So the Gemara says ksiv, so ksiv, ha'ir, it says the city, ukrinan chatzer. And yet we read it chatzer. We'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here, mikan le'istaracha shel melech shahayu ka'ayaros benonios. But so you see from here now, remember again. So we're going to see in just a moment, Yeshayahu was in the palace of Chizkiyahu. So the pasuk says, Yeshayahu says, I didn't even go out to the outer chutzner. Now that's really what it's right, to the outer chutzner. But the word is really ir. So what do you see from here? You see that the chutzner of the king was the size of a small city. Often the gardens, palatial gardens, were the size of a small city. So the Gemara said, now this is very important, because what the Gemara is doing with this pasuk is, it gives me a definition. It tells me that a chutzner could potentially be as large as a small city, which is very important from a halachic perspective. The chutzner could be almost as large as a small city. So the Gemara said, "B'may kamiflagi." So what are they arguing about? So the Gemara says, "Mar savar ayaros benonios havyon beiskar." So what they argue about. So now what we know is that a chutzner can be the size of an average city. So what is the size of an average city? So the Gemara says, so one opinion says the size of an average city is base core, is the size 30 beis sa'ah. Umar savar mem sin havyon. Another says no, it's 40 beis sa'ah. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Chananya seems to be like a din in Mitzias. Just what was the size of an average city? Was it 30 beis sa'ah? Was it 40 beis sa'ah? That's the discussion. So the Gemara says, just as an aside, Yeshayahu ma bai hasam. We'll say, why was Yeshayahu in the palace of Chizkiyahu? We'll say, just so you should know, Yeshayahu and Chizkiyahu did not get along very well. So what was Yeshayahu doing in the palace of the king? So we'll say, listen to this. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, melamed shechala Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu HaMelech was very ill. V'halach Yeshayahu v'hoshev yeshiva al pischo. We'll say, this is actually quite beautiful. And Yeshayahu came and he moved the yeshiva to the entranceway of Chizkiyahu's room. So that because Chizkiyahu was so ill and he couldn't come to the Beis Medrash, Yeshayahu brought the Beis Medrash to Chizkiyahu. It's actually quite beautiful. Rashi says over here, L'hoshev yeshiva, shel talmidim lasok b'torah pischo, shelo yehei rishus l'malach hamaves likanes l'sham. So as I say, interestingly enough, Yeshayahu had a plan. What was his plan? His plan was that he was going to go ahead and set up the yeshiva at the Beis Medrash. He moved the Beis Medrash to the entranceway of Chizkiyahu's room. what would that do? The presence of the Talmidim learning Torah would go ahead and prevent the Malach HaMaves ultimately from going into Chizkiyahu's room. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Mikan l'Talmid Chacham shechala shemoshivin yeshiva al pischo. You see from here that when a Talmid Chacham becomes ill, we go ahead and we move the yeshiva to the entranceway of his room. So I will say that's the kavod we give to a Talmid Chacham, that if the Talmid Chacham can come to the Beis Medrash, we move the Beis Medrash to the Talmid Chacham. To which the Gemara says, no, we don't. V'lav milsi. It's actually a bad idea. Why? Dilma asa le'igruye beis satan. Because maybe it's a bad idea. I will say, because ultimately, again, you're inciting the satan. I will say, that is interesting. So the Gemara says that maybe by going and actively preventing the satan from coming in, you're inciting. Remember, when we say satan, the Gemara Bava Basra says satan, malach hamaves, yetzer hara, all the same entity. All the same entity. So maybe maybe again by putting the Beis Medrash by the entranceway of the Chola's room, you're inciting the Malach HaMaves. So therefore, again, better not to move the Beis Medrash ultimately again to the entranceway of the Talmid Chacham's sick room where he's laying sick. So the Maharsha also just teaching the Maharsha has a whole discussion about this. If that's the case, then why did Yeshayahu do this? So the Maharsha says, interestingly enough, his lashon is. His lashon is that since, I'll read it to you. So his lashon is, Nira dekaya Talmid Chacham shechala she'in lahoshiv limod yeshiva, shomei haytam degiruye, aval b'chizkiyahu lo shaykh legiruye, kivan shekvar nigzar alav sheyamos. So it's interestingly enough, Yeshayahu was not worrying about inciting the Malach HaMaves. Why not? Because already there was a gzar din that he was going to die. So because there was a gzar din that he was going to die, therefore again, there was no concern about inciting the Satan. But apparently, in general, we would not incite the Satan. It was just an interesting idea. Also, like in general, like how much do you go ahead and fight against the Malach HaMaves versus how much do you accept the fact that death is a reality of life? So it's a fascinating idea. Do you pull out all the stops and move the Beis Medrash to the entranceway of the Chola's room? Do you go ahead and daven for the Chola, learn for the Chola, but at a certain point, quote unquote, not incite the Malach HaMaves? Just this fascinating discussion about, really it's a discussion about how we approach death. Okay, any event, so Yeshayahu was there, he went out and this is the story, very quickly, this is the story where Yeshayahu came to go ahead and visit Chizkiyahu. It was ostensibly for a Bikur Cholim visit. So Chizkiyahu says, why are you here? Remember again, Yeshayahu says, because you're going to die. That was the Bikur Cholim visit. You're going to die. So Chizkiyahu says, well, no, can't I go ahead and change my fate? No, Yeshayahu says, no, it's a Gzar Din. So Chizkiyahu says, I have a Masorah from my father, from the Zayda, from David HaMelech, even if there's a sharp sword resting against a person's neck, a person should not despair. A person should not give up. So Yeshayahu says, no, it's too late for you. You know why? You know why Akash Baruch Hu is punishing you? Because you chose not to marry and never have children. So Chizkiyahu never got married. But he didn't get married until then. So Chizkiyahu says, yeah, you know why? Because I saw b'nevuah that if I had a child, it was going to be a big Russia. So I decided better not to bring a Russia into the world. To which Yeshayahu says, why are you getting involved in God's business? So remember, Chizkiyahu says, Yeshayahu, fine, you have a daughter. I'll marry your daughter. Yeshayahu says, I told you you're going to die. Then again, Chizkiyahu says, I already have a Masorah. You never give up hope. Sure enough, Chizkiyahu married Yeshayahu's daughter. So first Chizkiyahu was healed. He married Yeshayahu's daughter, and they have a son. That son was Menashe, who was one of the longest serving monarchs. He went out and he reigned for 55 years. Was unfortunately a terrible Russia for 33 of them. Then did remarkable tshuva for 22 of them. Menashe is a fascinating individual. In any event, so that's the story. That's why Yeshayahu is in the palace. That's why he's there. So you see, he tries to help Chizkiyahu get better by bringing the yeshiva there. Ultimately, marries Yeshayahu's daughter, has a refuah. Good. The Gemara goes weiter. So I also heard that now we're getting into Erev Chatzeros. So what happened in the event? So the way Erev Chatzeros works very quickly is as follows. You have people who live in a chutzner with each other. Then what happens, I will say? So now, So now for Shabbos, in order to carry into the chutzner and to carry into the homes, so you have to go ahead and join together as one unit. How do you join together as one unit? Food. Everyone contributes. Everyone buys into the food. The food is deposited in one person's home, and the chutzner becomes like the property of one person. Everybody is considered to become like one entity. In the case in question, one person didn't participate. Then I will say, in general, if one person doesn't participate, so the halacha is, what happens? Reuven forgot to participate in the Eruv. Now it's Shabbos, so what do? Both there's the concept of bittul rishus. We're going to see all these concepts as we go on. Concept of bittul rishus. Bittul rishus essentially means that Reuven yields his rights in his property. He yields his right, we'll see, in his home, in his chutzner, and essentially again, so because he yields his rights, so therefore again, he does not asser the rest of the residents from carrying in the chutzner. So here we go. Says the Gemara, I also heard that if one person in the chutzner doesn't participate in the Eruv, he is not permitted, his home is asser. We'll see what that means. I learned both say that not only is his home usher to him, but for the rest of the residents of the chutzner as well. It's not a contradiction. Two different opinions. Watch this. The Gemara says, Both say, now watch this. This is fascinating. Here's the shayla. So we'll say we're dealing now with the concept of bitul rishus. So again, very simply, we have a chutzner, 10 families, right? What happened? Reuven forgot to participate in the Eruv. Now it's Shabbos. So what do? So Reuven is going to be mevatel his rishus. He's mevatel the rishus in his chutzner. So right, he yields his rights in the chutzner. So we'll say, so the shayla now is, when you go ahead and you yield your rights in your chutzner, does that automatically mean that you've yielded your rights in your home as well? So we're going to see this whole sugya, but that's the question. The nafkamina would be, are people allowed to carry into your home or not? So right, when you yield your rights in the chutzner, they can carry into the chutzner. Can they carry into Reuven's home as well? So Rabbi Eliezer holds that when you yield your rights in the chutzner, you automatically yield your rights in your home as well. The Rabbanan say, no, that's not the case. It's not the case. When you yield your rights in your chutzner, it's only the rights in your chutzner that you're yielding. You're not yielding the rights in your bayis. So the Gemara says, so pshita. So as the Gemara says, okay, we know this machlokes. What are you coming to add? Amarachba on the V'rafuna barchinina targamina lo nitzach ela lechamisha shishiyurin b'chatzar echad v'shachach echad mehem v'leir. But say, watch this. What's the case when we're bringing up this machlokes? Here we go. 5 people dwell in a chatzar together. And what happened? One of them, we're just going to call him Reuven. Reuven forgot to participate in the Eruv. So the Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Kishu mevatel rishus, so intzarach levatel cholech avrecha. Oh, we'll say, watch this. This is incredible. When Reuven, I just want to point out, what we're learning now is a sugya we're going to get to later on. So I'm just pointing out the Gemara is introducing it here now, but we're going to see this, like this, where it's kind of being thrown our way. This kind of came up in the Mishnah Derech Agov, but we're going to see it. We're going to see it not now, but later on. But watch this. The Gemara says as follows. So we'll say Reuven forgets to participate in the Eruv. So now what is he going to do? No problem. He's going to be mevatel his rishus, yield his rights, and that way again he does not stand in the rest of the way in the way of anyone else carrying. So the shayla is like this: does he have to be mevatel his rishus to every single person individually in the chatzar, or could he just make the declaration, I'm mevatel my rishus to the bnei chatzar? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, when he goes ahead and he's mevatel his rishus, he does not have to be mevatel it for every single person. But according to the Rabbanon, he has to be mevatel for every person. I'm both saying now, where does that come from? It's very simple. According to Rabbi Eliezer, when a person is mevatel his rishus, it's like he's mevatel ba'ayin yafa, right? He's mevatel, we'll call it like in a generous, comprehensive fashion. What does Rabbi Eliezer say? When you give up your rights in the chatzar, according to Rabbi Eliezer, what else are you giving up? What else are you giving up? Your rights in the bayis. Because Rabbi Eliezer says in general, when you're mevatel your rishus, you're mevatel in totality. So Rabbi Eliezer will say, when you're mevatel your rishus, you don't have to be mevatel to every single person. As long as you're mevatel to the bnei chatzar, that's going to be enough. What we call both say mevatel ba'ayin yafa. According to the Rabbanon, that's not the case. According to the Rabbanon, when you're mevatel your rishus in your chatzar, what are you giving up? What are you giving up? What are you giving up your rights in the chatzar? Not your rights in the bayis. Sefer according to the Rabbanan, Rabbi say what? You have to go ahead and you have to be mevatel your reshus to each and every individual. Rabbi say you hear this. If you look at Rashi, I'm not going to read a second because of time, but Rashi has this lashon that the machlokes is mevatel ba'ayin yafe mevatel ba'ayin ra mevatel. Rabbi say, do you hear the musar in those words? Mevatel ba'ayin yafe ba'ayin ra. See, Rabbi say sometimes a person has to be mevatel themselves. Right? Sometimes a person has to be mevatel. I have to be mevatel. Sometimes I have to be mevatel in that I have to be mevatel, I have to yield. And sometimes, again, I kind of just have to diminish myself because at the end of the day, I want to avoid conflict. So I will say, when you're mevatel yourself, are you mevatel yourself ba'ayin yafa, b'simcha, recognizing that in life it is so much more important to be happy than to be right. It is so much better to yield and not cause conflict. Are you mevatel ba'ayin yafa, or are you mevatel ba'ayin ra? Or sometimes a person is mevater, but they don't want to be mevater. I don't want to yield. I don't want to yield at all. I'll do it either because I want to look from, I do it because I'm scared, I do it because of a whole bunch of reasons, but I don't do it because of an ayin ra. I don't do it ultimately, I do it with a bad eye. Mevatel ba'ayin yafa, or it also applies, by the way, sometimes you have to be mevatel other people. Sometimes you have to be mevatel other people. Both say, again, this is going to sound very countercultural, but not every opinion is correct. And sometimes people are just wrong. Sometimes they're just wrong, and sometimes they're actually foolish. And sometimes even worse, they're stupid. And I will say, sometimes you have to be mevatel another das. How are you mevatel another person? Sometimes you have to do it. Are you mevatel ba'ayin yafeh? Mevatel ba'ayin ra. How do you negate? Sometimes you have to negate. You could listen, but sometimes you have to negate another opinion. How do you negate another opinion? Do you do it ba'ayin yafa in a nice, pleasant way? Because you could do that. Or do you do it ba'ayin ra? Do you go ahead and you mevatel adas by making a person feel like a nothing? Or you mevatel adas ba'ayin yafa? So we'll say this bittul atzmo, bittul achirim, fundamental life machlokes. How you mevatel yourself, how you mevatel others. Incredible. All in Rashi and Eruvin. So the Gemara says, Kiman azla hadisanya. So we'll say, whose opinion is reflecting the following idea? Chamisha sheshruim b'chatzar echad. If there are 5 people sitting in one chatzar, 5 people sitting in one chatzar, and what happens? So v'shachach echad mehen v'lo irev, and one of them forgot to participate in the eruv. Kishu mevatel reshus, so in tzarich levatel reshus l'chol echad ve'echad. When he's mevatel his reshus, he need not be mevatel to every single person. Kiman, Rabbi Eliezer. Ultimately, most of that reflects Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that mevatel ba'ayin yafa. Therefore, all you need to do is say, I relinquish my rights in the chatzar, my rights in the chatzar to the bnei chatzar, and that's it. You don't have to go to every single person. Rav Kahana Masni Hachi, Rav Kahana had a different version of this. He wrote, so Rav Tavyumi Masni Hachi, Rav Kahana Masni Hachi, Rav Kahana stated as you just said, Rav Tavyumi Masni Hachi, Kiman Azla Hadisanya, Rabbi said, according to whose opinion was the following stated, Hey Sheshrim B'chatzar Echav V'shachar Echav Irev, 5 people are dwelling in a chatzar together, and one of them forgot to go ahead and participate in the Erev. Kishu mevatel reshus, so eino tzarich levatel reshus l'chol echad ve'echad. When he's mevatel his reshus, he need not be mevatel his reshus to every single person. Kiman, whose opinion does that reflect? Amrav Hun Bar Yehuda, Amrav Sheshes, Kiman Rabbi Eliezer. Good. So we'll say again, this is the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. Are you mevatel ba'ayin yafa, mevatel ba'ayin ra? The Rabbi Eliezer says mevatel ba'ayin yafa. Therefore, again, when you give up the rights in your chatzir, you also give up the rights in your bayis. When you're mevatel to the bnei chatzir, that's not, you don't have to be mevatel to every single person. According to the Rabbanon, mevatel ba'ayin ra. When you give up the rights in your chatzir, you don't give up the rights in your bayis, and you have to go ahead and yield your rights to every single person. Rabbi Eliezer mi amar lo mevatlinan. So also listen to this. This is fascinating. According to Rabbi Eliezer, what happens if the guy says, I'm not mevatel my reshus? So look at Rashi for just a moment. Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who generally says that when you're mevatel, when you give up the rights in your chatzar, you give up the rights in your bayis. What happens if the guy says, I'm not giving up the rights in my bayis? What happens if he says that? Or according to the Rabbanon, if he says, I give up the rights in my bayis, what happens then? So the Gemara says, Tamid Rabbi Eliezer mishum dekasar mevatel reshus chatzir reshus beiso bitel. So it's very simple. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we say, generally we assume that if a person gives up the rights in his chatzir, he also gives up the rights in his bayis. V'hai amar ana lo mevatlinan. Now if the guy says, I'm not giving up the rights in my bayis, I'm not giving up the rights in my bayis, o dilma, Talmud Rabbi Eliezer mishum de bayis below chatzar lo avidi inshi de dairi. Or we say no, we'll say there's no such thing as a home without a chatzar. People don't live in a home without a chatzar, and therefore again the chika amar lo mavatlina lav kol kamine afagav de amar dairina lav kol kamar. Or do we say that at the end of the day, even though the guy says he's not giving up the rights in his bayis, there's no such thing as a bayis without a chatzar, and therefore we simply write off his words as nonsensical. So we'll say Rabbanan, and according to the Rabbanan, I amar mevatlinan. If he says I am mevatel the rights in my home, even though again according to Rabbanan he could hold on to those rights. My time with Rabbanan, mishum nekasav mevatel rishus chatzero rishus beis alobitel. In general, we say what's the reason of the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan say because a person who is mevatel his rishus and his chatzar does not automatically give up the rights in his home. V'hayda amar mevatlinan. But if this guy says I give up the rights in my home, then we take him at his word. O dilma. Time of the Rabbanan mishum the law of it inish the mesalik nafshe legamri mi bayis chatzar v'havi ki orach legabayhu. Because let's say, or is logical the Rabbanan like this: a person is never going to totally yield his ownership rights. He might give up the rights in his chatzar, but he's not going to give up the rights in his chatzar and his home because that would make him like a visitor, like reach in the chatzar, and the person is not going to do that. V'hayki kamrim v'atlinan. And when a person says, "I give up my rights," what's the halacha? Lav kol kamine. He's not believed to do so. He's not believed to do so. Amrle bein Rabbanan bein Rabbi Eliezer kevan de gali daite gale. To which the Gemara answers, the truth is at the end of the day, we take you at your word. If you say you're giving up, so we'll say, just so you should know that the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins is like the Rabbanan. That ultimately, again, we assume that when someone yields the rights in their chatzar, they do not yield the rights in their bias. We paskin like the Rabbanan in this case. And similarly, again, the halacha is when you're mevatel your reshus, you must be mevatel your reshus to every member of the chatzar. That's how we pass like the Rabbanan. However, the Shulchan Aruch says that so normally when we say I give up my rights in my chatzar, we say you give up the rights in your chatzar, but you're retaining the rights in your bias. But if you say that you give up the rights in your bias, then what? We take you at your word and you give up the rights in your bias. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, we paskin essentially mevatel ba'ayin ra'a mevatel. But that is only Hilchos Shabbos. Legabe life, we paskin mevatel ba'ayin yofe mevatel. That is halacha l'maisa. So I'll say, let's finish. So the Gemara says, I also heard that you could use arkabalin for maror. So the Gemara says, my arkabalin amaresh lakish atzavsa charuziasa. So I'll say, so Rashi says, what is that? Siv ava hagadol saviv hadekel. It is the thick vine that grows around the trunk of the palm tree. V'nichrach ala kilulave gifanim. So apparently the vine that grows around the trunk of the palm tree, halacha l'maisa again. So he heard that I had the dinamar. But I want to remind you, the Gemara Rabbi Eloi said this. He said, I heard these things, but I found no one to corroborate it. So although he heard that you could use this vine around the trunk of the palm tree, halacha l'maisa, it may not be used for murder. Hadran alach osin pasin. I was saying Mazel Tov. Begin a new parak tomorrow on Shabbos Kodesh. Yeshikayach, everyone.